why would you not compare Nazi Germany with Israel? Because Israel derives its legitimation from the Holocaust. It claimed to inherit the memory of those who died in the Holocaust, despite, as I show in my book, the actual record of the Zionists.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. Following the ceasefire in Gaza, many remain disoriented. It's impossible to move on like there wasn't just a horrific live stream genocide, the aftermath of which could still spiral into more genocide. The people who carried it out are still armed to the teeth. They're saying they're going to do it again, and there's been no accountability, just impunity. The parasitic imperialists who run the world now know that they can get away with inflicting an apocalypse. Amidst the growing police crackdown on Palestine solidarity in the West, Trump's ethnic cleansing peace plan for Gaza, and Israel's increasing resemblance to Nazi Germany, the true nature of Zionism and the historical and ideological roots of Israel's atrocities have never been more apparent. Joining me to discuss this and more is Tony Greenstein, a longstanding Jewish anti-Zionist, Marxist, and anti-fascist activist from the UK, and author of the book Zionism During the Holocaust, The Weaponization of Memory and Service of State and Nation. Tony is among the growing number of journalists and activists facing political persecution in the UK for standing up against genocide. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Tony Greenstein, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, hi, Rania. Nice to be back.
It's so good to see you again, to talk to you again. And before we start, I have your book near me. I just want to show it off.
All right.
Zionism During the Holocaust. It's so important. I want to remind people that they should buy it if they don't already have it, because it's such a useful resource on this very topic. But we have a lot to talk about today, some of which coincides with what's in your book, some of which has to do with what's happening in the world. And also we're going to get into some of what you're dealing with in the UK with the political persecution. But I wanted to start with something that's more relevant to the news at the moment. And that is we have Trump and Netanyahu and Musk having this meeting in DC this past week. When this episode comes out, it might have been the week before that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But basically putting out this proposal for basically like removing Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, for ethnically cleansing them from the Gaza Strip. He's calling it a peace plan and sending them to other Arab countries while they supposedly rebuild. So, I mean, when I was listening to this, I think probably you had a similar reaction. It just seems like Trump's plan, so-called peace plan, strips away this usual liberal pretense around Zionism and is just which is just raw ethnic cleansing at the end of the day, isn't it? Because I mean, Zionism's goal from the beginning was to always expel Palestinians, replace them with Jewish settlers to create this majority Jewish state. And it's managed to do that like bit by bit in different waves. And Israeli propaganda works like an overdrive, and with the help of all the corporate mainstream media, to obscure that reality and that history, especially in the West. So I guess, Tony, can you explain how Trump's plan is simply the logical extension of Zionism's original project?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is quite simple, really. I mean, when I grew up, and I grew up in a Zionist family, we were told the Arabs ran away. They were ordered to by the Arab regimes. We begged them to stay, but because, of course, they're brought up to imbibe anti-Semitism with their mother's milk, they didn't want to. And so we were forced to accept the situation as it is. Now, of course, that's a nonsense. And Israel has spent decades pretending there was no Nakba. I mean, they go to the extent of reclassifying archives so people can't get hold of any of the documents. So they deny it. In the words of Zippia Hotzavelli, the Nakba is an Arab lie. And yet, on the other hand, they do all they can to reenact the Nakba, but on a much bigger scale, as it turns out. So what we're seeing is Zionism stripping itself of the traditional lies, the obfuscations, the pretense, and so on. Because if you remember when Benny Morris's book first came out about the birth of the Palestinian refugee problem, I mean, it was a massive controversy. Zionists denied it. He was accused of being an anti-Zionist, which certainly isn't, and so on. But today, there is very little pretense that that is the object. The question really is whether they can get away with it. Yeah, it's been clear from the very start that there's Netanyahu, Smotrich, and the rest of them want the Gaza cleared. But the fact they want it doesn't mean they will get it. And my own view is I think Trump's plan is going to hit the buffers. It's going to meet with insuperable political problems. Even his closest allies realize that there's no way of dressing this up as a refugee, a humanitarian project, which is what he's doing. Oh well, I mean, he's so concerned about the demolition of Gaza, but you're supplying the bombs to do the demolition. You can't have it both ways. So I mean, Trump is not, if you like, the best PR guy. He is a crook, and he will remain a crook in every sense of the word. So I don't think they will get away with it. Although Netanyahu and Smotrich and the rest of them, for the Zionists, removing the Palestinians from Gaza is a wet dream. I mean, let's be honest about that. Yeah, that is really what they do want. And then, of course, you have Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who isn't the brightest thing on earth, but he looks at a place and thinks, "Oh, that's wonderful real estate development." Never mind the 2 million human beings who are living there. But this is the mentality of people who don't even pretend that they have a human impulse in their body. I mean, that's a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really incredible to see just bare like colonialism and a desire for land theft right in your face. But what's so interesting and ironic about it, right, is and this is something you've talked about a lot, is these monarchies, these Arab monarchies and dictatorships that are client states of the Americans across the region are actually the ones who would also stand in the way of this, not because they care about Palestinians, but because they're just not going to let 2 million Palestinians be ethnically cleansed into their territories.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
here I'm talking about Egypt and Jordan.
Mm,
Uh, so the logistics it logistically seems impossible. There's also the fact that, for the past 15 months, you had the entire Western world coming together to spend billions and billions of dollars to help Israel annihilate people in Gaza, and they
mm,
still weren't able to do it.
mm,
So I'm not sure like what they think is going to suddenly make that happen now.
mm.
Um, it's really incredible. I don't know if you have anything to add to that before I
Well,
move on.
that's right. I mean, the United States and the West rely on Egypt and Jordan in particular as their, if you like, pillars of stability in the Middle East and around Palestine. If you pour 1 million refugees into Jordan, you're not going to have King Hussein there for much longer. Uh, and if Jordan were to go, it could be the domino effect in reverse, because you remember Vietnam was based on the domino theory, because Egypt could then go. And if Egypt were to go, then who knows what would happen to King Saud. So I don't think the Arab kings and monarchs, despicable as they are, would uh, wear it for a minute because it threatens their own safety. And I think the US ruling class realizes that it hasn't been given a great reception politically in the United States or by the West. European leaders, even Starmer, I mean, if anyone is a poodle to the United States, then it's Keir Starmer. I mean, just have to tell him to jump, and he asks how high. But uh, even his pathetic foreign secretary, a complete fool called David Lammy, realise this is not a starter. But the other factor is that they haven't defeated Hamas.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Hamas are not going to willingly come out and say, "Yes, it's a great plan. Let's go ahead with it."
No, they're
Uh,
not. The one thing that captured my attention that I thought was interesting was there was this Jerusalem Post poll that found that 80% of Israelis support Trump's plan.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
80%.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, Israel is an immoral state. I mean, it's a settler state. I mean, I think 3% object to the plan on moral grounds.
Yeah, just 3% said this plan was immoral. I mean, this is a blatant open plan for removing people from their land. And I mean, is it surprising? Maybe not, but also 80%. 80%. So I guess, what does this tell us about Israeli society today? Not that Israeli society has ever loved Arabs or loved Palestinians being on their land, but Israeli society today is just more unhinged than it's ever been.
I suspect if you had taken a poll amongst white South Africans
Mm.
about ethnic cleansing, you'd get similar percentages. I mean, people always tell me that fascism is the worst thing. And in a sense, settler colonialism is actually worse when it comes to indigenous people because there's a solid alliance within it between the classes. I mean, when I talk to traditional Marxists who believe in the working class, they have these illusions that the settler working class is going to ally with the indigenous population and its working class. It's never happened. It's never ever happened. Whether it's Ireland, whether it's Algeria, whether it's South Africa, Canada, or Israel, because their identity is as Jews first, as part of that ethnic state. And so, yes, you're going to get that 80%. Uh, but in fact, in Israel, when it comes to war, it often goes up to 90 odd percent. So, I mean, in that sense, it's less than what you might have thought. But ethnic cleansing is part of the Zionist DNA. How else could you create a Jewish state if you don't expel the indigenous population? I mean, it stands to reason, really. And that was true of the left, so called, as well as the right. And today, is there a left Zionist movement anymore? I mean, Yair Golan of the combined Meretz Labour Party was the one advocating starvation in Gaza and invasion of Lebanon. I mean,
Unbelievable.
yeah. But generations of Western socialists actually believed there was a difference. I mean, including the Trotskyist Gilbert Achcar, who you might not have heard of. He's a professor at SOAS and is leader of the
Oh,
Trotskyist
I've heard of him, yeah.
USFI. I mean, he wrote, and I criticised him in my book. He wrote, you couldn't just say Zionism is racism because you have to distinguish between Zionists and Zionists. But the reality is there is no difference, except on tactical grounds. There is a minor difference there, but even that today, I mean, has disappeared in practice. So, which is why, I mean, Ben Gavir is now accepted. The Kahanists, whereas 40 years ago, Meir Kahan was ostracized in the Knesset. Today, the third largest bloc is a neo-Nazi bloc. So uh, it's come
Yeah.
round. It's
It's
come
full
round.
circle. So, and that on that note, I want to ask you because you recently wrote at the top of one of your pieces on your blog, you said, for those who don't like to compare Israel and Nazi Germany, my message is compare, compare, compare. At a time of extermination, it's important to understand just what kind of state Israel is.
Mm.
Can you elaborate on that? In what ways do you think that Israel resembles Nazi Germany?
Well, in virtually every way. I mean, Hitler did not start out with a program of extermination. He started out with something called Judenrein, wanting to be rid of the Jews in Germany. That was his main platform for 6 years. That was what the Nazis aimed at, driving the Jews out of Germany. was only when they failed and they became embroiled in the war that they created that they turned to genocide. And even then, there was an interim period of 2 years when they toyed with what was called the Madagascar Project. So, I mean, you'd have to read things like Raoul Hilberg's Destruction of the European Jews to see that extermination wasn't the product of a single order from Hitler. There's never been found an order, and I doubt if there ever will be. Uh, it was a culmination of a process of colonization, and the Jews were in the way. And what could you do with them? In the end, you exterminate them, and that's been, in a sense, the case with the Palestinians as well. They've gone from ethnic cleansing to genocide, and so why would you not compare Nazi Germany with Israel? Because Israel derives its legitimation from the Holocaust. It claimed to inherit the memory of those who died in the Holocaust, despite, as I show in my book, the actual record of the Zionists. I mean, today, every single word virtually is about the Holocaust. I mean, October the 7th was another Holocaust, etc., etc. But Zionism rests on that foundation. As I say, it claims to inherit the memory of those who died in the Holocaust. But the reality is, it inherits the memory of those who killed the Jews in the Holocaust. Its mentality is exactly the same. Rabbi, is it Marley, Eliyahu Marley, the head of the yeshiva in Jaffa, uh, who's one of the key, it's a pre-military yeshiva. So the students both learn the Torah and learn how to kill Arabs at the same time, and the two go hand in hand. But he was asked this question. He gave a lecture, and he was asked this question because he was in favor of killing the civilians. I mean, rabbis are bold. They go where no one else does. Uh, and he was questioned, "What about the children?" And he said, "Well, today's children are tomorrow's killers and fighters. So there cannot be any exceptions. Today's fighters were yesterday's children. Why do you have moral qualms?" But this was the exact answer that Himmler gave in his famous speech in Posen on October the 4th and then October the 6th to senior SS generals in Poznan, Poland, which was played, it was a tape recording, it was played at the Nuremberg trials. And he said the same thing, that Jewish children will become the avengers of their parents. And so we have to exterminate them too. So Zionist mentality has come round to the same way of thinking. Although they still hold every 3 times a year memorial services for the Holocaust, but it doesn't affect their policy. And you see in the West, like today's the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust in Britain, but elsewhere as well. We must learn the lessons of the Holocaust, they intone, but don't mention Gaza. Uh, so it's clearly just hypocritical cant. That's why we should mention it,
Yeah.
because we inherit it, because we do inherit the lessons of the Holocaust when we say never again, and we don't selectively apply never again.
Yeah, that's definitely the case, and, it's so horrible to think this. I mean, you and I were on the you had me on this panel that you helped organize for Holocaust Remembrance
Yeah,
Day, and
yeah,
I really I learned a lot from what everybody said, but as I was preparing my remarks, one thing that came to mind is because of the amount of times that the Holocaust is invoked by Western warmongers to either justify atrocities against Palestinians or even just atrocities against the third world in general. Like everything is always the next Holocaust. Every dictator is always the next Hitler. When it's a dictator the US doesn't like. Saddam was the next Hitler. Bashar al-Assad was the next Hitler. Maduro is a Hitler. Like everyone is Hitler, and we have to destroy and regime change any country that misbehaves because we're preventing a Holocaust of some sort. So it's like my brain has been conditioned to actually get scared when I hear the memory of the Holocaust invoked, which is really sad when you think about it.
yeah,
The way that, yeah.
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the Holocaust, which wasn't, of course, just of Jews. I mean, there were the Gypsies, the Roma, the disabled, which is where it started inside Germany itself with the mentally and physically handicapped. And then, of course, the planned destruction of 20, 30 million Russians in order to take over the breadbasket. 2 to 3 million Poles in Operation Tannenberg. I mean, the list goes on, Russian prisoners of war. I mean, all of this was absolutely horrific, but what lessons have they drawn from that? Well, I think we know. I mean, it wasn't just Saddam who was a Hitler. I mean, it started with Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was the Hitler
Mm-hmm.
of the Nile. And then the lesson of,
Really? Wait, I didn't even know that
yeah,
actually. I didn't know that he was referred to.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, he was the first Hitler, uh, and it went on from there. Then one of the main lessons from the Holocaust, of course, is appeasement. You must never appease a dictator. So that is always used for why you go to war. And that was said, of course, of the Iraq war, that you can't appease a dictator. It was said of Nasser again in the Suez War, uh, and so on. So imperialism draws all the wrong lessons from the Holocaust while never actually looking at its own record during the Holocaust. So, I mean, I say in my book, and I only quote a few things. Anthony Eden worrying in a telegram to the American State Department that Hitler might turn from extermination to extrusion. And then what would you do with all these refugees? I mean, fortunately, Hitler never wavered. But the fact is that, I mean, the British were worried and the Americans were worried. I mean, so the true record of the Holocaust never gets shown, and we see that in the American Holocaust Museum. I don't know if you've ever been to it in Washington, but
I have, yeah.
yeah, I mean, the first thing I noticed, because I went there, God, it was about 30 years ago, was Pastor Niemeyer's saying, which was emblazoned in the ceiling, I think, above the entrance. We first came for the socialists, the trade unionists, etc. Well, Pastor Niemöller started it with it. We first came for the communists, but that
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't
They
fit
took it
in with
out.
the war. So that's it. So they can't even be honest. But Israel's done that actually with its own. I mean, there were Zionists amongst the left Zionists who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto, for instance, Klinger, for one, Tovia Altman, and others. And when they came to Israel, or when their memoirs were printed, they simply altered them to remove all criticism of the Zionists, who'd urged them not to take part in the Warsaw Ghetto, but to escape to Palestine via
Mm.
a rat run. But of course, now today you won't hear any of that. But it is common knowledge.
I'm curious your thoughts on something that I often think about with regard to everything we've witnessed, obviously over the last 15 months, but it was taking place before. This kind of, imperialist weaponization of Judaism, right? Like taking Jews from around the world and convincing them to go basically be on the front lines of imperialism in the Middle East in this
Mm.
um, you know, unsinkable aircraft carrier called the State of Israel. And obviously we make a distinction between Zionism and Judaism. Judaism is a religion that's been around for a very long time. It's the oldest monotheistic religion. Zionism is relatively new and actually comes out of Christianity originally. And that we've talked about that on the show, but we've reached a point now where, it's it's sad because you see like across the US you'll see synagogues take part in indoctrinating for Zionism and trying to convince young Jews in the US to go visit Israel, to go be in Israel, to go even settle in Israel, right? You have all these major Jewish organizations in the West that have made their priority defending Israeli settler colonialism
Mm.
rather than representing people who belong to this particular religious group. And I mean, you yourself grew up in a Zionist household, so you probably have experience with the entanglement of Zionism with Judaism in modern day society. But,
Mm.
I'm just curious your thoughts on the way Zionism has essentially morphed the oldest monotheistic religion into a weapon to the point where it's marginal in the West to find like a Jewish organization that is advocate, and they do exist, but they're up against these much larger organizations that are Zionist, the ones that are advocating against it.
Yeah, I mean, from the very start, Her- Herzl started it with the approach to groups which became Mizrahi. Zionism wished to cloak itself in the symbols of the Jewish religion, so it adopted the Star of David and made it into a major symbol which it wasn't previously. Uh, that has been the Zionist strategy to combine, to say, in the words of Rabbi Mervis, the chief rabbi here, that Zionism has been integral to Judaism for 3,000 years. Of course, this is rewriting history, and they're
Yeah.
very good at it. Uh, but when Zionism came about, of course, the fiercest opponents were the Orthodox Jews, and actually Reform Jews as well. The Pittsburgh Declaration of 1885 of American Reform Judaism disavowed any idea of the return. They wanted to strip it from the prayer book because their main concern was Jewish emancipation and Jewish rights in America, Jewish emancipation in Britain, uh, and the same throughout Western Europe. They weren't interested in the return, so called. This was a Christian idea, the return to Palestine. Uh, it was a precondition of the return of Jesus, I think, to this earth. If you are into all that end times eschatological nonsense, but Judaism, of course, like any religion, adapts to its circumstances. It's true of Islam as well. I
Hmm.
mean, what's Wahhabi? It's in essence an imperialist distortion of Islam. Uh, it cloaks, if you like, the interests in the end of imperialism in order to provide it with a legitimacy it wouldn't otherwise have. So we see today the most ardent, barbaric, if you like, Islamists like ISIS and so on, who on the one hand sit down with the Israelis, on the other hand will cut off your hand if you so much as move. And as for women, well, you really don't have
Yeah.
any place whatsoever. But this is inherent in Islam. Islam developed in many directions. There was the culture in Spain and so on. Islam was civilized when the West, were walking in the forest, as it were. Uh, but the West has, of course, turned that round. So, the same with Judaism. Judaism had dispensed with all the kind of blood curdling threats to non Jews uh, and actually created a separate section of the Talmud, a dispensation, to remove the idea that, killing a non Jew wasn't as bad as killing a Jew and so on. All religions develop. I'm a Jewish atheist, so uh, I'm in the tradition of those who ate ham sandwiches, Jewish anarchists outside the synagogue on Yom Kippur. I don't really go with it, but Judaism had progressed; it had become more tolerable. Religion, I don't think. I is always a repository of the most backward sentiments, but Judaism had advanced. Reform Judaism and so on. Today, the vast majority, of course, of the Jewish religion, not all, there are sections. Neturei Karta, some of the anti-Zionists, Satmar, Hasidim, and there are those rabbis around Jewish Voice for Peace, for instance, who do
Hmm.
posit an alternative Judaism. I wish them good luck. I'm not sure how far they'll get because, of course, the West sponsors the mainstream Zionist Judaism. We saw that in London. We couldn't march from the BBC because we might disturb a synagogue that no one even knew was near the route. And the Metropolitan Police were just so concerned with the rights of Jewish worshippers. It wasn't true. Uh, I'm bringing out a blog soon on the actual record of the Met when it came to the Mosleyites in the 30s and genuine
Ooh,
anti-Semitism.
that'll be
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
The accounts of people who were involved in fighting the fascists. I mean, the Met were riddled with fascists and anti-Semites. When it really counted, that's whose side they were on. So I mean, imperialists not stupid. Every imperial order needs a moral legitimacy, and today Jews provide that. And
It's yeah. It's very sad, and I wanna on that note ask you about the just because since we're on the theme of Zionism's basically attack on Judaism is how you could describe it. I going back to the Holocaust Remembrance Day panel that we were on, I actually was attacked by these ridiculous Zionists online. I don't care, but it was
mm,
interesting to me. They attacked me for stating at that Remembrance Day panel that Zionism imposed European Jewish history onto Arab Jews, stripped them of their culture, and uprooted them from their actual homelands to boost Israel's
yeah, yeah,
Jewish
yeah.
population. And so I wanted to ask you about some of the history here because Zionists aggressively deny this reality, but there's also this long history of racism against
Mm,
Arab Jews within that movement, because there's also this racial
mm.
hierarchy among Israeli Jews, of course. So I guess my question for you is, Tony, how did early Zionists view these Arab Jews, and how does that racial hierarchy persist in Israel or among Zionists today?
Well, the original attitude to Arab Jews was probably epitomized by a guy called Arthur Rupin, who was
Mm,
the director of the Palestine office from 1908. He isn't very well known, although there's an Arthur Rupin, I think, Boulevard in Tel Aviv. But Rupin was probably the second most important Zionist after Ben Gurion in the pre-state Yishuv in the Palestine Mandate. Uh, and he brought over thousands of Yemenite Jews to do the dirty work, the hard work. And there's a really good essay, in fact, it's a PhD thesis by Etan Bloom on Rupin from Tel Aviv University. And Rupin believed that they were a dysgenic element, that the Arab Jews simply did not have the cultural level of Western Jews,
mm,
and that we should certainly not build uh, the Jewish state on them. And so he brought these Yemenite workers over, and he denied them anything but the most basic food. Their wages were lousy, their health facilities were non-existent. Uh, and Bloom called this pathological stereotyping because 50% of them died off. And in the end, they stopped coming because all the tales of returning to the Holy Land, which had been spread in Yemen, turned out to be false. So their attitude to the Arab Jews was, we'll use you when you can, but we don't really want you to be part of our society. Now, after the Holocaust, that changed. I mean, the only real reason why Ben Gurion started to wake up and others in the leadership to the Holocaust very late in the day was that the fear that there would be no Jews left in Europe in order to become settlers in Israel. And they'd have to take these Arab Jews, not because they wanted them, because they had no choice. And so after 1948, their eyes were set on places like Iraq, where Jews were, in the top tier in a sense. One third of Baghdad was Jewish. It was a Jewish city, uh, much like in New York. I mean, and so they consciously set about destabilizing them. And there was a Zionist underground there. And it's documented. I mean, the best book to read is probably Avi Schleim's book, Three Worlds. And if it's Avi Schleim is a professor, an emeritus professor now of modern history at Oxford University. Uh, or Marion Wolfson's old book, but it's still very good, Prophets in Babylon. And they describe what happened, how Zionist agents went in Iraq in particular, but we think Morocco and other places in the Arab world. Uh,
Egypt.
yeah, I mean, Egypt was a different affair. It was called the Lavon affair, which brought down Moshe Sheraton. In the end, Ben Gurion as well, where they sent agents into Egypt to simulate uh, local people and started planting bombs, but they were pretty amateur. And one of them got caught as his bomb was about to explode. Two of them were hanged in the end, and the whole network was uncovered. It was partly to persuade the Americans that Egypt was unstable, uh,
Mm.
but it rebounded into. It was called the Lavon affair. They don't discuss it now, but as I say, it led to the removal in the end, or the resignation of David Ben Gurion, who was the longest serving prime minister until Netanyahu. But in Iraq, they had a Zionist underground. It had been left over. It had the arms from the British Army in the Second World War, and it's clear that they went around planting bombs outside Jewish cafes, businesses, and then the final straw was they threw a grenade, I think it was, into the courtyard of the Masud Hashem Tov synagogue in Baghdad. Uh, and I think two people died and a number were injured. And this produced a stampede. They'd already reached an agreement with Nouri Assad, who was the prime minister, that Iraq would take the wealth of the Iraqi Jews, because they were very wealthy, and Israel would take the bodies. Uh, and that's exactly what happened. So all these flights started going from Iraq. I mean, they'd already given them the option of renouncing their Iraqi citizenship in 1950. So this was Israel's strategy. It needed a working class in Palestine, and there weren't enough Ashkenazi Jews, but also they wanted to climb up, so they were happy to have a reservoir of labour. But when they got to Israel, it wasn't the promised land. I mean, the first thing that happened when they got off the plane was they were sprayed with DDT in order to to eradicate.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, they were treated like
Some
animals.
Nazi stuff right there.
And when they say to you, "Oh, this is a conspiracy by you anti-Semites saying that we planted bombs and so on," the Iraqi Jews themselves believed it. And it
Mm.
was printed, it was widely distributed. Halam Hatzeh reprinted. Uh, this was a satirical weekly by Yuri Avneri. They reprinted an article on what happened in Baghdad, the bombs in Baghdad. Uh, most Iraqi Jews believed that Ben Gurion had been responsible for the operations of the Zionist underground. So, I mean, even who is it? Tom Segev in his book. I mean, it's one of the best books, The Seventh Million, says, well,
Mm.
clearly there was some foundation to it because people believed that. So to now turn around and say this is all anti-Semitic nonsense, I'm sorry, it just doesn't wash, because it was Iraqi Jews themselves who believed it,
It's really
and they
sad.
had
It's
the
really
reason.
sad.
They knew it. I mean, and some of these agents were caught, and one was hanged in Iraq, because despite the fact the Iraqis bent over backwards to exonerate them, in the end the evidence just piled up.
It's so amazing the way this narrative goes by. And it's, of course, you'll have like these Israelis who will invoke that like they're half Iraqi, or they like have an Iraqi or Jewish mother or father or something, or they're half Moroccan or something like that, to be like, how dare you? And their whole thing, which is what they're taught in Israel, is that like basically the entire Arab world is just a bunch of like Jew hating Nazis. But it's weird, they became Jew hating Nazis in 1948 and after.
Yeah.
Like everything, like where was the Jew hating Nazi behavior before Israel's creation? And also, they weren't Jew hating Nazis. The Zionists actually actively played a role to try to lure Jews around the region to come to Israel to do exactly what you said, which is to become basically the working class, the labor, so that these like Ashkenazi elites wouldn't have to do the farm work. I mean, that's essentially what happened.
Yeah, I mean, when the Iraqi Jews and other Arab Jews came to Israel, there was a program of de-Arabization, and again, Avi Shlaim mentions, he gives an incident where his father uh, comes into the street and calls to him in Arabic, and he turns bright red because this is a complete social taboo. You might speak Arabic at home, but you never ever speak it in
Mm.
public. And the same had happened with, of course, Yiddish, which was the language of the European Jews. They consciously replaced it. It was a diaspora language. And in Israel, you only spoke Hebrew. And when the first Yiddish theatre put on a play, there were thousands demonstrating outside it because this is, not kosher. Uh, it, the new Jew didn't speak Yiddish and didn't speak Arabic. So there was that conscious program of de-Arabization. So when those like Ben Gvir, for instance, is descended from Iraqi Jews, say we have Iraqi Jewish heritage, you may do, but culturally and politically, that link has long been severed. And of course, today the Arab Jews, who are still the lower classes, if you like, in Israel, are the most racist and rabid in a sense. I mean, they are the poor whites of Israel. The kind of trailer trash. I mean, they harbour the most vehement anti-Arab sentiments, which has been cultivated in them, of course.
And
Uh,
by the state of Israel, by the way. Like, at one point Joseph Massad makes about that is he says, all these, like the sort of Ashkenazi elite in Israel will say, "Oh, these like Arab Jews or these Mizrahi Jews or whatever are so like backwards and ignorant and right wing." And he makes the point that they learned that in Israel. Like Israeli culture made them that way. Not
yeah,
really.
I,
It wasn't their parents who were like that. It was like the children and grandchildren of the Arab Jews who, were pushed into Israel.
yeah. I mean, what's been forgotten is that historically the Arab countries were the refuge for Jews from Europe. So when you had the Inquisition in Spain, where did they go? I mean, many of them went to the North African countries. Uh, Maimonides, the greatest Jewish philosopher, uh, where did he go? He went to become the physician for Saladin, for example. What happened when the Crusaders came to Palestine in the 10th and 11th centuries? Again, they were defended by the Muslims. I mean, historically, I mean, Islam never had that antagonism towards Jews. The Christianity did. But today, of course, Christian feudal anti Semitism is forgotten because
Mhm.
it's not convenient to remember it, except on the streets of Jerusalem, where you have and then it is de rigueur to spit at Christian priests and assault them. Uh, and as Ben Gvir said, it's a Jewish custom, so it's
Wow.
sanctified. Uh,
Well, I think there's another interesting aspect of this to tie together two of the topics that we've been discussing, and that's the weaponization of the Holocaust, as well as like this idea of projecting European Jewish history onto Arab Jews who make up a pretty sizable chunk of the Israeli Jewish population.
mm,
And one thing you and I haven't gotten a chance to talk about is in your book, Zionism During the Holocaust, you discussed how the Holocaust is used specifically in Israeli society to instill racism in Israeli youth. And I think
mm,
this is super interesting because obviously this is still the case today. And it's so different than other major Western countries. And what I mean, like, with that is that unlike in places like the US and the UK, where the trend is that younger generations are often more progressive than their elders,
mm,
Israeli youth are actually more racist and right wing than their
mm.
parents. So, can you talk about the role of that Holocaust education plays in shaping that ideology?
Well, really, it starts with the Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem. It was established under the law in 1953, the Yad Vashem law. Uh, and this was to create a Holocaust museum, but it was really charged with developing the whole Holocaust narrative. Uh, and when I say that, what I mean is it was a very they rewrote Holocaust history in many ways. It was called the Holocaust and Heroism Martyrs Museum. So they magnified heroism out of all proportion, and they pretended that somehow that in order to if you like, fit with the Israeli narrative that you don't succumb to your enemies, you fight them. So, I mean, the ghetto revolts, and the word ghetto revolts, but they were few and far between, of course. I mean, it's the same in Gaza. I mean, most of the population uh, couldn't fight back against Israeli tanks. I mean, Hamas could because they were underground, but and it was a guerrilla struggle. But most ordinary Palestinians had to flee before the tanks and the soldiers. The same in Europe. The ghetto Jews were not generally in a position to fight back, except almost with axes in their hands. So they rewrote a lot of that history, but they also rewrote it in terms of the fact that those who fought were really fighting to come to Palestine, although that didn't occur to them at the time. But you can always rewrite history backwards. It's quite easy, and that's what Yad Vashem did. So, I mean, there was a number. I mean, there were very few histories of the Holocaust at the beginning. I mean, today we have thousands of nonsense books over every aspect. I mean, many of them leave a lot to be desired, to say the least. But there were two in particular. There's Gerard Rettlinger's The Final Solution and Raoul Hilberg's 3-volume. I mean, I've got it here. I mean, I'll just show it. I mean, this is the classic. He was professor at Vermont University. You probably can't see it, but there's
No,
3 volumes.
the destruction of the European Jews. That's what it's
Yeah,
called.
yeah, and Yad Vashem refused to print it because
Really?
it didn't accord. He attacked the Yiddenrat, the Jewish councils, which in essence were a Nazi tool. Wherever they went, wherever they established a ghetto, they established a Jewish council to rule over the
Ah,
Jews.
like a Palestinian Authority, but the Jewish version.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
They supplied the lists of who was to be deported. They often rounded up the Jews who were to be deported. I mean, Israel Shahak, who was one of the first and most famous Israeli anti-Zionists, he was a professor at the Hebrew University, said that even during the Great Action from June to September, October 1943, when something like 300,000 Jews were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto. He said you rarely saw a German soldier. It was done by the Jewish police.
Oh.
And that was the same all over. I mean, Warsaw was the biggest ghetto, of course. But yes, I mean, and that's why Hannah Arendt got into such trouble when she wrote about the Eichmann trial in 1961. She wrote a book, very famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and it's a short book and it's really worth reading. Based on she visited it and reported for the New Yorker and then wrote it up into a book. And she said, without a Jewish leadership, there would have been plenty of misery, but and suffering, but far more Jews would have survived. The Jewish leadership was the essential tool in the hands of the Nazis. And this was anathema. I mean, to the Yad Vashem, they hated it because,
But why?
you know,
Yeah, why?
well, for a start, most of the leadership of the Yidden was Zionists. That's why.
Okay, that's what it's about. All
Yeah, I mean,
right.
and also, I mean, Zionism is a bourgeois current. I mean, it's aligned with imperialism from the start. It wasn't a working class or revolutionary uh, movement. It's allied with British imperialism. It wanted to ally. It, if you like, I mean, the people it won over in Europe were rabbis and so on. I mean, it provided that leadership because that's how it gravitated. And so the Zionists are very careful about protecting the reputation of the Judenrat. Although the Jews that came to Israel in 1948 and before were absolutely contemptuous of them. And Haj Klinger, who was one of the Zionist leaders in the Warsaw Ghetto, one of the fighters, she came over, I think it was in 1944, and she gave a speech at the Histadrut, the Zionist trade union, so called. And she excoriated the Zionist leadership of the Judenrat and said we have to bring them to trial, etc. But her reward was that her diaries were so rewritten that you had to go back to the source to actually understand what she was saying. I mean, they just excised whole passages, changed them, and not just her, but uh, all of them, all of the Zionist fighters, and I say the Zionists, the young Zionists, not their elders, not the parties, but the young Zionists, in essence, dispensed with their Zionism, and Zionism had no meaning for them. So when they came over, they were full of anger and rewrote up their memoirs and writings, and they were changed. And Shabtai Bet has brought out a 2-volume history of everything. I mean, it's massive. It's a lot of
Wow.
unnecessary detail, but he details all of that. Uh, and there's no dispute. You can now get Haj Klinger's original diaries, which is, I think, produced by Yad Vashem, so you can read it in the original. But they changed the accounts of the Zionist fighters to accord, if you like, with the national narrative, which is, of course, that what the Holocaust means is that Jews must be powerful in order that no one can commit another Holocaust. But in the process, of course, it's led to the increased militarization and nationalism and so on. They don't draw any universal lessons from the Holocaust because that would be
No.
taking away moral capital from them, as they call it. So,
I mean, it's interesting this hearing you break it down like that. It makes me think of, I mean, obviously Jews were a part of Europe. It wasn't like this was a different country or something, but it because of the way that Nazism, fascism is this kind of internalized colonialism, if you will. Um, it's almost like just like with the colonization of like the Americas and the colonization of Africa and of Asia and even, across the Middle East, you have this comprador class, right? You can't do it without them. You
of
can't
course,
do it without that. And this is what you're describing is like a Jewish comprador class
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
inside Europe.
yeah, I mean, it was the Nazis selected the traditional leadership for the role they played. I mean, not every Judenrat. I mean, that there were certain fighting Judenrats. Often they were the nearest the forest where the partisans were operating. Minsk is a case in particular where the Judenrat actually was the base for the resistance as well. But the Nazis simply hanged the head of the Judenrat and then killed the next leader as well uh, until they fulfilled their role. There were a few. Was another. I mean, there were a few Judenrat who bucked the trend, uh, depending on the circumstances in the ghetto itself. But by and large, they collaborated. People like Chaim Rumkowski and Lodz. I mean, was a very pliant tool. I mean, in the hands of the Nazis. I mean, he selected and he sent the children first to the gas chambers, in a sense. Uh, it didn't do him much good because in the end he followed them. In fact, he was killed on the train by member Jews in the train because of what he'd done. But they were mini tyrants. Rumkowski printed a stamp with him riding a horse around the ghetto. I mean, they had delusions of grandeur. Uh, in Warsaw, I mean, the Judenrat really were an instrument of the Jewish bourgeoisie in a sense. I mean, they sent the poor to work for the Nazis for a pittance, literally, and that meant that the richer Jews escaped. Of course, in the end, they all died, but in Warsaw, the resistance, the first target of the resistance was the Judenrat. They killed them and the Jewish police. And as Shahak said, because he was a child survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, if they hadn't done that, if they hadn't killed the collaborators, there would not have been a resistance. And he was
Mm.
saying that in the context of Palestinians also killing their collaborators. I mean,
I mean,
without
it's a
that,
pretty normal thing. It's a pretty normal thing to do, actually,
well,
historically
yes,
speaking.
yes, I mean, yes, I mean, treason always used to be a capital offence in Britain, but it's denied to the armed resistance against imperialism. I mean, yes, I mean it makes sense that. Well, I mean, Hamas has done the same. It's killed collaborators.
It's not unique. It's definitely not unique, especially when it comes to anti-colonial struggle or any actually just historically speaking, it's not unique. But Tony, I want to ask you because I want to make sure we have time for this because it's very important. Um I want to ask you about the political persecution that you're experiencing right now. And I want to just quote you. You recently said, in the eyes of the law, resisting genocide is a greater crime than committing it.
Mm.
So, can you tell us what has happened to you in the UK? What were you arrested for? What are the charges you're facing? What the hell's going on?
Well, it's a good question because the prosecution hasn't divulged what it's relying on at the moment. They have certain time period up to April to disclose. But I was arrested on December the 20th, 2023 at 7 in the morning by the police, who told me I was being arrested for a tweet I posted a month ago. And you might imagine that at 7 a.m. in the morning, I would not remember even what tweet. But in the end,
Right.
I don't have a photographic memory in that sense. It was a Zionist who said, challenged people, just say three words, I support Hamas. And I said, no, I support the Palestinians, but as part of the resistance, and of course I support Hamas. And when the police cross-examined me later in the day, I said, well, when it comes to fighting the Israeli genociders, I would support the devil himself. I mean, but it doesn't mean politically I support him. So that was the case. But I understand. I mean, I was originally charged under Section 12(1)(a) of the Terrorism Act 2000 with, and it's expressing an opinion or belief which is supportive of a prescribed organisation. But it now appears that I'm being charged in the different section, still Section 12, of inviting support for Hamas. But it's, of course, a nonsense because what they're doing is prescribing organisations they don't like and saying they are terrorists. Now, you can read my blog. I have a number of articles critical of Hamas in terms of their social and other policy. I don't think Hamas is a
Well,
revolutionary organization. Uh, when people demonstrated in support of the overthrow of Mubarak, they actually cleared the streets. I mean, Hamas comes from the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean,
Brotherhood, yeah.
they're a conservative group. So politically, I don't support them. If anything, I would support the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. But when it comes to the resistance, then Hamas clearly are not terrorists. I mean, we understand what terrorism is. It's when the Manchester bombing here, when a bomb is set off and 22 young kids die at a concert, or the Bataclan attack in Paris, or any other similar atrocity that ISIS or Al Qaeda committed. But here's the irony, of course, that the West created Al Qaeda and ISIS. So the terrorism we're fighting, we actually have created. But what they've done is they've applied the terrorist label to the resistance. And that's not new. I mean, the Nazis termed the French resistance terrorists, or the Polish resistance. I mean, and the British termed the IRA terrorists. But what the British didn't do was outlaw and prescribe the political wing of the IRA, which is Sinn Féin, which is now the major party in the
Mhm.
north of Ireland. If they had done, there would have been no Good Friday Agreement. And by prescribing Hamas, not only its military, but its political wing, what they're in essence saying is the whole struggle of resistance against genocide is itself illegal.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.